Good morning, everyone. Good morning, right? Yeah. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Ms. Spaulding served as Undersecretary leading the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Mission at DHS, where she managed a $3 billion budget and a workforce of 18,000. She led the transformation of budget, acquisition, analytic, and operational processes to bring greater agility and unity of effort to an organization that had experienced dramatic growth through acquisition of new entities and missions over several years. At DHS, she led election security efforts and the development and implementation of national policies for infrastructure protection, including development of the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. She worked with industry to establish CEO-level coordinating councils in the electric and financial services sectors, and chaired the federal government's aviation cybersecurity initiative to identify and address key cyber vulnerabilities in the national aviation system. She is currently on the board of directors for GW, though that's not how we managed to convince her to speak here. We got to give credit to Stafford Ward. He has a position in DoD that conflicts with EVN, and so his last gift to us was he asked her to speak here, and she graciously agreed. She's also on the advisory board of Harvard University's Defending Digital Democracy Project and the faculty of the National Association of Corporate Directors. Ms. Spaulding has served in Republican and Democratic administrations and on both sides of the aisle in Congress. She was General Counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and Minority Staff Director for the U.S. House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. She was a member of the CSIS Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th Presidency, which developed a bipartisan national cybersecurity strategy in advance of the 2008 election. She was also Executive Director of the National Commission on Terrorism and the Commission to assess the organization of the federal government to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and a consultant on the advisory panel to assess domestic response capabilities for terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction, and the Commission on the intelligence capabilities of the U.S. regarding weapons of mass destruction. She is a member of the Aspen Institute's Homeland Security Group, former chair of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security, founder of the Cybersecurity Legal Task Force, and was a member of Harvard University's long-term strategy project for preserving security and democratic freedoms in the war on terror. And this is a highly edited biography. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Suzanne Spaulding.
Thank you very much, Poorvi, for that much too long introduction. I will just, it needs to be updated because I had been on the board of the GW Center for Cybersecurity and Homeland Security, and the director of that center, Frank Salufo, moved to Auburn University, and he moved the entire center with him, so I am now affiliated with Auburn University. So, but I'm really pleased to be here at GW, and particularly pleased to be here to talk with all of you in the context of the EVN election verification conference. Really, yeah.
So I'm sorry, I was reminded to let you know that this is being live streamed, if that's okay with you.
Well, if it's not, what are we going to do? Pull the plug? No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
We can disconnect.
I'm teasing. No, it's fine. Absolutely. But, you know, we all have learned long ago not to put anything in an email that you wouldn't want seen on the front page of the paper. I try not to speak to a room of more than about 2 or 3 people without the expectation that it will go public in some way. So I'm perfectly fine. But I did want to thank the organizers of this EVN conference, and really to thank each and every one of you for all that you do to help ensure that this defining pillar of our democracy is in fact secure, reliable, accessible, private, all of the things that Americans expect will be essential elements of our election system. And there's really only so much that we, certainly in the federal government, can do. And it really does take the kind of work that all of you are doing, whether it is the kind of academic research as computer scientists, helping find some technical solutions, to advocacy to make sure that people take this seriously, to the work of the election officials who work so hard every day of the year on an unbelievable long list of things that they have to do to prepare for elections, to the vendors who provide the technology, to all of the folks that are engaged in this. So I want to start by saying thank you. Poorvi thought it might be of interest to you to hear a little bit of the inside story of what was going on in 2016 at DHS, how it looked from our perspective. And then I thought I would take a few minutes to talk to you about what I'm doing now, what I've done since I've left, the Defending Democratic Institutions project, as well as the work I'm doing on the advisory board of Harvard's Belfer Center's Defending Digital Democracy project. So we'll start, it actually starts in 2015 when the office that I had created as the Undersecretary at DHS, called the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, did put together a description of what we would try to get our arms around under the rubric of election infrastructure. What does that mean? What are the key nodes and key vulnerabilities that, as an element of the government charged with cybersecurity and the protection of the infrastructure that Americans rely upon, should be thinking about? And so they did that, and of course, not surprising to everyone in this room, it went well beyond election voting machines. That seems to be really all the public seizes upon, is the security of that particular machine, and reminded us that really it starts with at least voter registration, when voters go to register, however they might do that, and then the gathering of that data, the storage of that data, the updating and changing of that data, all the things around voter registration databases, and then all of the things around election day, from the poll books to the voting machines to the reporting of data, through the election official state and local chains, but then the television reporting of election results as well, media reporting of election results, that all of those things were things we needed to be thinking about and making sure were secure and reliable. What we started seeing then in 2016, of course, was some suspicious, malicious activity in voter registration databases. And when we saw that, our initial thought was confidentiality of information. Because that's what we had gotten so used to, right? Is people hacking into these vast databases of personally identifiable information for a whole variety of reasons. And so we thought, confidentiality of this information. And then, we pretty quickly realized that the information, most of that information is really can be found other ways through public sources. And as we thought about it, we thought, this is very likely something else. And we realized pretty quickly that this was likely part of an information operation, that it was really designed. What could you do? Sort of our thinking was, what could you do if you had access to voter registration databases? You could, of course, all of you in this room are aware of this. You could change that data. So we quickly moved from it was primarily about the confidentiality of that data to it was about the integrity of that data. It was about the access to that data. Those are the three key areas that we focused on in terms of impact in cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and access. This was very likely, we thought, pretty quickly about integrity and access. And you all are aware of the kinds of disruptions that could be caused if you deleted lots of names, just changed some spellings, changed addresses, changed assigned precincts. And if you did that on a scale, you could cause disruption that would cause the American public to lose confidence in the credibility and legitimacy of the process, which causes them to lose confidence in the credibility and legitimacy of the outcome of the election. And we pretty quickly realized that was our greatest risk. That was what we should be most worried about. And so we did start reaching out, sort of late spring, early summer, to state and local election officials primarily through the National Association of Secretaries of State. And a very small group at first, the leadership group there. Initial calls to say, look, we're seeing some activity. We want to make sure that everybody is aware of what we have to offer, how we can partner together to make sure that we both have secure, reliable, but also that we can assure the American public to have confidence in the outcome. Those discussions carried on, again, with smaller groups, and the Secretary of Homeland Security wanted to talk with all Secretaries of State. We were asked to wait until after their August 14 meeting. So now we're as for those of you who are involved in the list of all the things you have to do, by the time you're looking at mid-August or later, you're way late in the process. So that was, lessons learned. I'm sharing with you, sort of our dirty laundry, if you will, that we needed to start that process much earlier, and that is something that the folks at DHS have taken on board. We were having some really important conversations pretty late in the game. But we did have those conversations. We talked about what we could bring to the table in terms of offering scanning of systems, of the publicly facing, of the systems to find out what's facing the internet and whether, we could detect known and suspicious malicious activity, but also then deeper, which we could do remotely and really scale very quickly. But we also offered deeper vulnerability assessments, which required hands-on kind of folks sitting side by side with the IT staffs in the state and local election offices, and were more resource intensive. We gradually, over time, got significant pickup on the scanning, less interest initially in the vulnerability assessments, and we had limited capacity to provide those. But at least the conversations were happening. What could the federal government bring? How could we partner together in this effort? The Secretary then at that time was considering whether to designate election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. We had pretty quickly concluded that it met the definition. The definition of critical infrastructure is assets, systems, networks, whether physical or cyber, the disruption of which would have a significant impact on economic security, national security, public health and safety, or any combination thereof. And our assessment was that if you could really mess with our election system, that had pretty significant implications for national security. And so, our assessment was whether you designate it or you don't designate it or whatever, it meets the definition. But it was, needless to say, an extremely sensitive topic of conversation with our state and local election officials. We were speaking primarily with secretaries of state at this point, who worried this was a new concept. What does it mean? What does it bring with it? Is this a federal takeover of elections that are appropriately led, managed, run at the state and local level, right? And so we worked hard at trying to explain that there was no regulation that came with this. There was nothing mandatory, purely voluntary relationship, but it brought with it certain advantages in terms of triggering the kinds of prioritization and support that we could provide. It triggered, potential tool of sanctions to deter foreign actors from disrupting, because we have a sanctions regime if a foreign actor disrupts or creates or attempts to hack into critical infrastructure. It brought with it an ability to formally, legally protect vulnerability information that state and local officials might share with DHS so that we could work collaboratively to close some of those vulnerabilities. We have unique legal authority with respect to protecting infrastructure information, PII regime. So those discussions were underway, but a lot of emotion attached with that, with those discussions and with that designation. Fast forward, thanks primarily to the really hard work of state and local election officials all across the country, the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, and probably many of you in this room, we did have, we did get through the election season without significant disruption. I do give some credit to President Obama raising this in person with Putin to say, we see you, we know what you're doing, cut it out. But it really was a collective effort by a lot of people that got us through that. And then, of course, after the election, not wanting to, disrupt the important work of state and local election officials prior to the election, after the election, we did indeed say, yes, this is critical infrastructure. And as all of you know, as a result of that, subsequently, they have established a sector coordinating council, which is the private sector organizing effort, which means it's primarily, I think, and those of you who are part of it can correct the record, but I think primarily the technology and equipment manufacturers of election infrastructure. But there is also a government coordinating council. This is same as what we do for all the other sectors, electricity, transportation, water, et cetera. There's a government coordinating council that is an FSLTTGCC. Isn't that fun? Say it really fast. Federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal government coordinating council. And those are just, mechanisms for bringing the right players around the table to have conversations so everybody understands what's going on, everybody can share and bring to the table what they can contribute to this most important effort. There's also an election infrastructure ISAC. ISAC is Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and that is primarily focused on sharing cyber-related information, though it's not limited to cyber-related information. The ISAC, Election Infrastructure ISAC, actually has seats and representation in our NCIC, I say our, you'll forgive me, it's been 2 years, but it's still near and dear to my heart, in the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, the NCIC, which is the 24/7 operations center of the Department of Homeland Security, focused on cybersecurity and communications. And they have representation right there with the government folks who are working these issues every single day and getting information from the intelligence community, as well as from state and local election officials and other private sector entities, and the ability to collaborate. One of the things that we know we did wrong, we did share information as we saw it, what was happening in cyberspace and on the networks and the voter registration databases with folks in the states. But we shared it through the multi-state ISAC, or we shared it with the folks in the states that we were used to dealing with, not fully appreciating, particularly in some states, the separate nature of the state secretaries of state. And that if we weren't getting it directly to them, in some instances, they weren't getting the information. We learned later. So we have these mechanisms now to make sure that we're getting the information to the people who actually need it, to act upon it in a timely way. We were limited in the information we could share because it was developed by others in the government, and some of it was classified. So DHS started getting clearances for folks so that we could share classified information, but more importantly, working even harder to get information declassified. So the answer is not to have one person in your shop who has a clearance who can get information and then can't tell anybody, right? The answer is to get the information that network defenders need, that state and local election officials need to take appropriate action, and get it declassified. So we learned a lot of lessons in 2016, and I think you'll hear from DHS, but they're implementing a lot of them. My focus since then, since noon on January 20th of 2017, has been on this confidence, Americans' confidence in democratic institutions. Because as all of you appreciate, even if you do everything right, if a malicious actor gets out there and spreads a message that they have in fact, when they haven't even, that they have in fact penetrated, gotten in and changed a bunch of votes, eliminated a bunch of votes, whatever, changed the outcome of the election, you create an atmosphere of mistrust. And again, the trust and confidence in the legitimacy of this process is absolutely essential to the peaceful transition of power. If people do not respect the credibility of the outcome of an election itself does not guarantee democracy or the peaceful transition of power. We have seen that in countries all over the world. So the work that all of you do is so critically important. And when I got out, I started thinking about how critically important that was, that at the end of the day, it was really about trust and confidence in our system. And I thought, what other institutions? We know the intelligence community put out a report in January of 2017 that made it very clear. Russia's campaign was not just focused on elections and did not start in 2016. That was part of, and continues to be part of, a broader, longer-term campaign to undermine public trust and confidence in democracy itself and in our democratic institutions. So I thought to myself, what other institutions in our democracy are as dependent on public trust and confidence in their legitimacy and the outcomes, the credibility of their outcome, to have meaning and to be able to do their job? Well, clearly, to some degree, all of them. But what I really focused on was the justice system, right? Courts can't enforce their decisions. I mean, they can hold a person in contempt. But if the general public decides that they don't believe in the credibility of a court's decision and start to ignore the decisions coming out of our courts, we're in big trouble, right? If we don't believe the investigators, the prosecutors, the judges, right, that they are in fact independent and impartial on the whole, with all the flaws of our justice system. But if we don't believe that fundamentally our system is worth holding accountable and worth respecting, then you can easily see there an unraveling of democracy as well. So that's what I've been spending the last 18 months or so on. Is I thought, well, I haven't heard anything about Russia going after the justice system. Maybe we're getting ahead of something for once. I was wrong. Once I started looking at it, the evidence is there, including setting up fake groups in, and in Twin Falls, Idaho, trying to turn protesters out into the street, arguing that judge and prosecutor, are all in cahoots with the politicians and spreading false allegations, to other cases where they have taken divisive issues, particularly around immigration and racial justice, and where they bump up against the justice system, using those to spread and promote and amplify messages that the judges, the courts, the prosecutors, the justice system is just a tool of the establishment, of the politicians, of the elite. RT, Russia Today, television outlet that's been, that we know to be a propaganda arm of the Russian government, has a weekly program called America's Lawyer. And it's hosted by an American trial attorney. And the unrelenting theme of that program is America's justice system is corrupt and broken. It's in the hands of politicians and corporations. And it is irrevocably broken. And the risk there is not just that people get a one-sided view, but that they do begin to give up. That our population starts to do what so much of Putin's population does, which is shrug your shoulders. That we can't, it's not worth trying to hold our system accountable. It's not worth advocating for improvements because the whole system is corrupt and broken. And then you disengage. Or you take to the streets, not to bring about change, but to register just your anger in ways that are not constructive in a democracy. So, and that's the internal coherence that Russia tries to undermine. So I talked to you about that. I wanted to mention that today, in part because I would like to be on more people's radar screens. It is not just elections, but I think all of our democratic institutions that are being targeted. We know Russia is the most brazen and the most active, but we see other players. And it's only a matter of time before they become more energetic as well. And It is to tell you, to emphasize once again, that the work you're doing is putting you on the front lines in the defense of democracy. And it is so critically important. And I will end with where I started, which is to say thank you so much for what you're doing. So I think we have a few moments. Yes. Oh, I'll let you.
Which first?
Yeah. Start here and then sort of move around. Yeah.
Hi, Ron Vandies with Vote Allegheny. Thank you very much for that talk, and thank you very much for the work you've done since being in DHS. But my question is going to be about your time in DHS. Why was the election infrastructure designated in it as its own sector for critical infrastructure as opposed to putting it in the government sector? And if I could also ask, did DHS scan any states without their permission? Without the permission from the states?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, and particularly the second question. Certainly, from my knowledge, the answer is absolutely no, absolutely not. You all may recall that there was an allegation out of one of the states that DHS had, been trying to hack into their system, and an IG inspection and other outside reviews showed what we knew to be the case, which was that was absolutely false, was not at all what happened there, and there was no effort to hack into that state's systems or any other state's IT network. The election infrastructure actually is a subsector in the at least on the government side. There is the larger government sector is that SLT GCC, and this is FSL, TTGCC. This is a subsector within that. So I'm not, the private sector coordinating councils are really private. They're organized by the private sector, and I'm not as sure whether that's slated in under something, but.
So the separate ISAC is not an indication that it is its own sector?
No. It's at least on the government side, as I say, it's a subsector. Yes.
Ron Rivest, MIT. Thanks for your remarks. I appreciate the DHS designating election systems as critical infrastructure. I have one question about what that might mean. Does DHS get involved at all with purchase decisions? I'm concerned about jurisdictions moving towards internet-based voting systems, for example.
So get involved is a broad phrase. And I would hope and expect that DHS can help develop guidance, right, that might help inform some of those decisions. But everything that CISA, the thankfully renamed organization that I led, which was then called the National Protection and Programs Directorate, it's a horrible name, and I fought for 5 years to get a name that told you what we did, and now it's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. All the work that they do, with the exception of one regulatory regime in chemical facilities, everything else that they do is purely voluntary. Anybody who doesn't want to interact with DHS doesn't have to interact with DHS. So they're not involved from the standpoint of requiring that purchase decisions reflect certain standards or guidelines. Primarily what DHS does, what CISA does, is to help inform appropriate risk management decision making.
Maurice Turner, Center for Democracy and Technology. As a follow-up, are we beyond the time where voluntary is sufficient, and when do we move toward mandatory requirements if we're talking about critical infrastructure plus national security? So
there are contexts in which other departments and agencies regulate, including in the context of cybersecurity, industries that are otherwise regulated, right? So we see regulations in energy and financial services. I think the way we are most likely to see what federal efforts to really promote standards and something that, let's just say federal standards, would be through grant and providing funds, right? So I just don't see a political climate in which the federal government is going to impose through statute requirements on state and local election officials with regard to how, the running of elections. And I can tell you, having lived through the emotion attached to a simple recognition that it met the definition of critical infrastructure, that I don't think the political will is there. But I do think there is some real promise for providing much more significant resources to state and local election officials who desperately need that to do the things we want them to do. And that with at least some of that grant money or that funding would come requirements that it be spent in ways that reflect the risks, right?
Chris Walker, Jackson County Clerk, Oregon. I want to first of all thank you for the hard work that you've put into this and for supporting all of the local elections officials. There's several of us here today. I think we're probably in the minority in this group, but we're here, so that's important.
Good for you.
So I wanted to make a comment pertaining to the bad actors. We have them internationally, we have them in our country, but we also have them at the local level. We had a situation where we had a Senate race that would have changed the makeup of our legislature, and I'm not going to get into politics of that. But when we had a very close race in my county, the next thing I get a call from the news media stating that, oh, there's the legislature, leaders in the legislature are saying that you may have lost ballots in transport. You dropped them behind a filing cabinet. These things were done to cause perception within our system and to create turmoil within our electorate, to cause disruption. So we also need to call all of us in our home offices, in our local legislatures, around our own and work on our own home as well, because those things were completely false. It was done, again, to cause disruption. When we did the recount, we balanced that race to zero, which was almost scary, because usually you're going to have one exception or something in that matter. But I worked directly with the state. They were there with us. So just my comment is we have bad actors in all mediums, and they have political motivations. So what we do, you have to give a lot of respect. That was a very stressful time for us. We made it through it. We're better because of it. But without your support, without the support, all of the support, we couldn't do what we do. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Again, I got a glimpse of the incredible amount of work that all of you do, and really grateful for that. I think it is a reminder of how important communications, having a communications plan. So I mentioned that I'm on the board of the Defending Digital Democracy project initiative up at Harvard's Belfer Center, and they have put out playbooks for state and local election officials, as well as a playbook for campaigns, because we didn't even talk about that, but obviously some of the efforts to information operations targeting campaigns also then reflects on undermining the credibility and legitimacy of the outcome of the election. So it's got to be part and parcel of what we look at. But they have a playbook for campaign or election officials that includes a very good annex on communications, the whole communications piece, because that, again, what we're really focused on is public confidence. The communications piece becomes critically important. And there is no place in this country that is too small to attract interest. I mentioned Twin Falls, Idaho. When I first saw in the press that, as we were learning more about what the Internet Research Agency had done out of St. Petersburg, the Russian propaganda outlet, and I saw that they had tried to turn people out into the streets in Twin Falls, Idaho, I thought, Twin Falls, Idaho. But it's a very compelling story, actually, and it makes you realize that anyone can be a victim of whether it's domestic mischief or foreign mischief. So thank you. Yeah.